Viewer discretion is advised. Before we begin, a warning. This isn't just another talk show moment. It's a collision between ego and expertise, spotlight and science. The studio lights at the View burned brighter than usual that morning. You could feel the anticipation in the air, that hum of expectation before something goes wrong but no one knows it yet. Cameras rolled, laughter echoed, cue cards flashed, and behind every smile sat quiet calculation. Joy Behar had been waiting for this one. She wasn't just hosting another guest. She was setting the stage for what she believed would be a subtle takedown. Dr. Phil McGraw, America's most famous television psychologist, had been invited to discuss psychological behavior in leadership. But everyone knew what that really meant. Joy's eyes sparkled with confidence. She'd rehearsed her question in front of the mirror, polished every word until it sounded both casual and lethal. The plan was simple: lead Dr. Phil toward a conclusion, one that would validate what the show had been preaching for years. All she needed was his professional stamp. But Dr. Phil wasn't the type to play along with anyone's narrative. As he walked onto that stage, his expression calm and unreadable, he carried something invisible yet unmistakable: authority. The kind that doesn't come from television fame, but from decades of facing real people in real pain. Hands took his seat and smiled that calm, unhurried smile of a man who already knows how this will end. The audience applauded, expecting fireworks. Joy leaned forward with that practiced blend of charm and sharpness. Cameras zoomed in. The moment she'd been waiting for had arrived. "So, Dr. Phil," she began, voice silky, controlled, almost playful. "You can't diagnose someone you've never met, but a lot of respected psychologists, really big names, say Donald Trump shows signs of narcissism." She paused, savoring the weight of the words. "Do you think narcissism is a mental illness? And if so, is he fit to be president?" It was a trap dressed as a question, and every person in the studio knew it. Air went still. Even the audience's nervous laughter seemed to hang in midair. Dr. Phil looked at her for a moment, expression neutral, but eyes alert. Then came the smallest smirk, the kind that says, "I see exactly what you're trying to do." "Well, counselor," he said slowly, with that measured Texas drawl that could soften steel, "that's a compound question, and I object." Shoreline, relief, but it wasn't a joke. Behind the humor, behind the charm, something shifted. Joy didn't see it yet, but the game had changed. Phil hadn't come to validate anyone's bias. He'd come to remind them what real psychology sounds like when it refuses to be weaponized. He reached into his jacket pocket and unfolded a sheet of paper. Notes, highlighted and crisp. The DSM-5 criteria for narcissistic personality disorder. "You know," he continued, "people throw this word around a lot, but most don't actually know what it means. So let's take a look at what narcissism really is." And with that, the tension in the room thickened. Each word he spoke, what Joy had planned as a performance, was slowly turning into something far more dangerous, an education she didn't sign up for. Dr. Phil's voice filled the studio, calm and deliberate, like a teacher addressing a restless classroom. He glanced down at the paper, then back at the hosts, his tone steady. "1," he began, "a grandiose sense of self-importance." Before he could continue, Joy interjected quickly. "Check." Laughter erupted again, but this time it sounded nervous. "2," he continued, "preoccupied with fantasies of success, power, brilliance." "Check again," Joy said, grinning, believing she was on a roll. Dr. Phil didn't look up. 3, believes they are special or unique, can only be understood by other special people. "Check," she said louder this time. "We've seen that plenty." The rhythm of the room had changed. The audience followed Joy's laughter at first, unaware that every check was a step deeper into a trap she couldn't yet see. 4, Dr. Phil continued, requires excessive admiration. "Check, check," Joy said, leaning back in triumph. That's when the energy shifted. Dr. Phil paused, the silence deliberate. He lowered the paper and looked directly at her. "You see, these traits aren't rare," he said. "They describe a lot of people. Politicians, sure, but also actors, television personalities, talk show hosts." The laughter died immediately. His eyes held hers for a moment, calm, unblinking, before he continued. "And if we started removing everyone who had some of these characteristics, we'd be left with very few people, including some at this table." The words hit like a slow-motion collision. For a second, Joy's confident smile froze. Her eyes darted, searching for a comeback, for control, for footing that was suddenly gone. The studio, always loud, fell eerily silent. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate before moving. The audience didn't know whether to laugh or hold their breath. What they were witnessing wasn't a television moment anymore. It was something real, something raw. And Dr. Phil had flipped the entire power dynamic. He hadn't insulted anyone, he hadn't raised his voice. He had simply held up a mirror. And what reflected back wasn't politics or performance. It was ego, projection, and the uncomfortable truth of people who claim to analyze others without ever analyzing themselves. Joy finally forced a laugh, the kind people give when they're trying to reset the tone. "Oh, come on, you're not saying we're narcissists, are you?" Dr. Phil smiled. "I'm saying psychology's about understanding patterns, not pointing fingers. We all have traits. The question is how aware we are of them." The camera panned across the table, faces tight, smiles faltering. You could feel the tension clawing at the edges of the frame. The audience had come expecting entertainment. What they got was a revelation. And Joy realized far too late that her clever question hadn't exposed anyone else. It had exposed her. Jang's silence that followed wasn't ordinary silence. It was thick, almost physical, like the air itself had turned into glass. You could sense the unease ripple through the studio. Laughter strangled mid-breath, eyes darting toward Joy as if waiting for her to recover the power she'd just lost. Joy straightened in her chair, forcing composure. "Well," she said, her voice rising an octave, "you wouldn't say that about President Obama, right? You can't just say they all have it." Phil didn't blink. His calm was unnerving. "Joy," he said evenly, "most leaders in politics, business, entertainment show traits that overlap with narcissism. They deal with pressure, expectation, and public scrutiny most people can't imagine. Confidence, assertiveness, ambition, those things can look like narcissism from a distance." He leaned back, hands folded. "That's why real psychologists don't diagnose from afar. You can't call someone mentally ill because you don't like their behavior." That line hit like a quiet explosion. The studio audience didn't cheer this time. They just listened. Joy's lips tightened. She knew she was losing control of her own show, and worse, of her own narrative. Her question, meant to provoke applause, had turned into a lecture she couldn't interrupt. Dr. Phil continued, his tone soft but cutting. "You see, the danger in modern media is this habit of playing doctor for ratings. Calling people narcissists or sociopaths without examination isn't psychology. It's entertainment dressed up as expertise." Every word was a scalpel. The crowd leaned in. He gestured lightly toward the audience. "The truth is, a lot of us see traits in others we refuse to see in ourselves. That's what projection is. It's easier to diagnose someone else than to reflect on your own behavior." Joy's forced smile cracked for just a moment. Then defensiveness replaced discomfort. "Well, you're on television too," she said almost accusingly. "Aren't you part of that same entertainment machine?" Phil nodded slowly. "I am, but I don't confuse entertainment with science. That's the difference." The room stayed quiet. No laughter this time. Just that strange, heavy awareness that something authentic was happening in a place built for performance. For a few seconds, Joy's co-hosts shifted in their chairs, glancing between her and Dr. Phil, unsure whether to jump in or stay silent. But Dr. Phil didn't need anyone else in the ring. He'd already won, not by defeating Joy, but by dismantling the entire game she'd tried to play. He looked back at her, not with judgment, but with clarity. "You invited me here for a diagnosis," he said softly, "but what you're getting is a reminder. Psychology isn't about labeling people we disagree with. It's about understanding what drives behavior, including our own." And there it was, the turning point. The audience, still processing what they'd seen, began to applaud. Slowly at first, then louder. Not for Joy, not even for Dr. Phil as a celebrity, but for the uncomfortable truth he'd laid bare. Tried to smile, tried to regain her footing, but the camera caught it. That flicker of realization in her eyes. The look of someone who'd invited an expert to expose someone else and ended up being the case study herself. The applause faded, but its echo lingered. You could almost hear the control slipping through Joy's fingers. The rhythm of the show no longer hers to command. She sat still, eyes steady but distant, searching for a comeback that never came. Dr. Phil's demeanor didn't change. He wasn't smug, he wasn't gloating. He spoke with the measured cadence of a man teaching a truth too simple to be comfortable. See, when we start labeling people we don't like as mentally unwell, he said, we stop listening. We stop trying to understand. Psychology becomes a weapon instead of a window. The camera moved across the other hosts. Whoopi, Sunny, Sarah, their expressions frozen somewhere between fascination and disbelief. They'd seen political arguments before, celebrity feuds, fiery interviews, but this was different. This wasn't conflict, it was correction. Finally broke the silence. "So what are you saying, doctor? That we can't talk about behavior anymore? That calling out toxic traits is off limits?" Dr. Phil tilted his head slightly. "Not at all. Call out bad behavior, challenge lies, debate policy, but don't hide those things behind clinical terms you don't fully understand. Because once you start deciding people you disagree with must be mentally ill, you stop debating ideas and start dehumanizing people." He paused, letting the words breathe. And that's how every ugly chapter in human history begins. That landed hard. The studio's tension wasn't just political now, it was moral. The kind of silence that makes even the camera operators forget to breathe. Joy tried to laugh it off, but it didn't land. "You've really thought about this, haven't you?" Dr. Phil smiled faintly. "Every day for 30 years. Audience, sensing the gravity of the moment, began to clap again. But this time, it wasn't for entertainment. It was for truth. Deceived, producers exchanged glances. The segment had gone off script long ago, but none of them dared to interrupt. What was unfolding wasn't chaos, it was clarity. Joy leaned forward, voice softer now. "You really think that's what we were doing?" "I think," Dr. Phil said gently, "that sometimes good people convince themselves they're fighting evil, when all they're really doing is projecting their own reflection onto someone else." He wasn't attacking anymore. He was diagnosing the culture, a culture that confuses moral outrage with insight. Joy sat back, silent. No witty retort, no applause line. Just that look, the one that says the mirror has done its job. As the spell drew to a close, the director's voice crackled in the earpieces. "Wrap it up, move to commercial." But no one moved. The moment was too real to cut away from. Phillips adjusted his jacket, leaned forward one last time, and said quietly, "Integrity isn't agreeing with people. It's telling them the truth, even when it costs you something." Then he smiled. Not for the cameras, for himself. The lights dimmed for commercial, but the room didn't exhale. Not yet. Because everyone in that studio, hosts, crew, audience, knew they hadn't just watched an interview. They'd witnessed a reckoning. When the cameras cut and the lights softened, silence lingered like smoke. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Even the producers, usually quick to rush in with notes and schedules, hesitated at the edges of the set. Joy sat motionless, staring at the empty chair where Dr. Phil had just been. The applause had ended. The segment was over. But something about the way he'd left, calm, unshaken, untouched by the chaos he'd walked through, made it feel unfinished. He had entered her world and left it rearranged. The co-hosts tried to fill the air with small talk, but the words sounded brittle. You could almost see them calculating how to spin what had just happened. But deep down, they all knew the truth. They hadn't invited a guest. They'd invited a mirror. Outside the studio, clips began spreading within hours. First through fan accounts, then political channels, then news outlets. Headlines couldn't resist it. Dr. Phil turns tables on The View. Psychologist outsmarts hosts on live TV. When expertise meets ego. People watched the same few seconds on repeat. The line that broke the internet. If you take out everyone with those traits, you'll take out a lot of people, including some at this table. Threats that moment became more than a viral soundbite. It became a symbol of how truth sounds when it refuses to serve a side. Social media split in two, as it always does. Some praised Dr. Phil for defending the integrity of psychology. Others accused him of political bias. But buried beneath the noise, a quieter conversation began among real mental health professionals. They saw what the audience missed, that Dr. Phil had invoked something sacred, the Goldwater Rule, the ethical cornerstone of psychological practice. The rule that forbids diagnosing public figures from afar, the principle that separates science from speculation. He reminded everyone why that rule exists, one psychologist wrote online. Because the moment psychology becomes political, it stops being psychology. Another added, that wasn't a defense of any politician. It was a defense of professionalism. For every heated debate, there was reflection. Uncomfortable, necessary reflection. People who had spent years throwing clinical words like darts suddenly found themselves wondering if they'd crossed lines they didn't understand. Crimson Joy never publicly addressed the exchange in detail. On the next day's episode, she made a brief joke about it, masking discomfort behind laughter. But even that laughter sounded different, a little thinner, a little self-conscious. Because deep down, she knew she'd been outplayed not by cleverness, but by integrity. At Dr. Phil, he didn't gloat. He didn't issue statements or victory tweets. He simply moved on, back to his work, back to what he'd always done. Helping real people face real problems instead of diagnosing strangers for entertainment. Crimson, however, never really died. It lived on as one of those rare television moments where the performance cracked open and truth slipped through. It reminded viewers of something simple yet forgotten. That expertise isn't about confirming what you already believe. It's about challenging what you refuse to see. The real twist wasn't that Dr. Phil embarrassed Joy Behar. It was that he exposed a cultural habit far bigger than one show. A habit of turning disagreement into pathology, of confusing moral certainty with mental superiority. And somewhere, in that quiet corner of recognition, viewers understood. Adidas watching wasn't narcissism in others. It was the blindness within themselves. That's why the clip endured. Not as a scandal, not as politics, but as a mirror. The kind that doesn't lie. Because when truth finally walks into a room built for performance, everything rehearsed suddenly feels small. And sometimes, the most cinematic moments in television aren't scripted at all. They're the ones where someone refuses to play the part you wrote for them. Crimson, unleashed and simply tells the truth.